Alrighty, hi there everyone. My name's Indigo and I'm ACMI Strategic Research Lead. I'd like to begin our post-lunch session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present and extend those same respects to any First Nations colleagues joining us here today. Thanks so much for coming back after lunch. I hope you had a wonderful break and the start of some really inspiring conversations after this morning's panels. This conversation with my illustrious colleagues here is really about the future of media. We're interested in the journey from broadcast to narrowcast and on to multicast, and what is gained and what is lost as these changes multiply. In the lead up to this panel, I was doing some reading for another project, a side project, and I bumped into an old favourite quote from Sabina Mihelj and colleagues that I wanted to share as a bit of a kind of context-setting piece for the conversation to come. Writing in 2019 in the academic journal New Media and Society, Mihelj and colleagues argue that, and I think the slides will come up in just a moment, yay, that the rise of digital media coincided with a crisis of public service media, the privatisation of communication infrastructures, and growing reliance on commercial revenues within the media sector. As a result, digital media follow the logic of commercial profit, with much of the cultural content protected by paywalls or embedded into digital platforms that are privately owned and reliant on advertising revenue. Unsurprisingly, a large majority of search engines and recommendation systems that operate in this environment and which shape citizens' digital cultural diets are driven by commercial considerations rather than by public interest. As such, they operate on the principle of market segmentation, seeking to tailor recommendations to specific niche markets rather than aiming for universal access. Accompanying all of this is the rise of a curatorial culture within which everyone is expected to curate their own cultural diet. I find these words to be really instructive. And in the 5 or so years since they were written, I don't think we've seen these dynamics change so much as exacerbate. And over the top, we've seen the rise of generative artificial intelligence overlaid. So today we're going to explore what these dynamics mean for access, for equity, and for the future of public culture. And we're going to do that by circling around these questions of who controls, who creates and consumes, and who benefits. With us today to unpack these dynamics is Scott Smith, founder and managing partner at Changeist, Angela Stengel, head of digital content and innovation at the ABC, Stuart Buchanan, head of screen at the Sydney Opera House, and furthest away from me, ACMI's very own Keri Elmsly, executive director of programming. We met for an initial chat about 3 weeks ago, and it was clear then that there is an enormous amount to say in this topic and not much time to get through. So I'm not going to waste our time together by reading out bios. You can jump onto the conference website and download the speaker pack. There's heaps of information in there. But instead, I'm going to suggest that each panellist begin their first response by giving us a little bit of context of who they are and where they're coming from. We're going to try and carry the chatty energy of this morning's panels through to today, so I encourage panellists to ask each other questions, and of course we're going to bring you into it. I have Slido up in front of me, and I'm going to be trying to weave your conversations and questions into our chat as we go. We're not going to wait for a particular audience spot, so please do feed them in as we go, and hopefully this gives you a bit of a sense of where we're going. Oh, can we have the QR code to remind people? That's a great point. Wonderful. All right, I'll give you 2 seconds to get your QR code ready. All right. We're going to get straight into it with who controls. The shift from broadcast to platform-based media represents perhaps one of the biggest transfers of cultural power in recent history. Public broadcasters, cultural institutions, global platforms, and communities are all negotiating their place in this new digital landscape. Scott, I'm going to ask you to kick us off. You describe Changeist's work as helping clients around the world to identify, to make sense of, and to tell stories about what's next. I want to use that expertise to try and set some boundaries around this conversation. What is your work telling you about media consolidation and transformation? What do you consider the media today, and who's in control?
Wow, okay, so nice kind of small, easy question to answer.
Exactly.
So I've basically been working in and around this field now for about 30 years. Moisturize constantly. And so, kind of a lot of what we focus on is trying to kind of watch the big picture, not get too far drawn down individual rabbit holes of what's happening this year or next year, in a kind of media planning sense, but to be able to look at the bigger picture of not just kind of what's happening with technology, but also people and cultures, human behavior, society, and how those two things kind of keep working with each other. And I think we talked about it at the top there. First of all, trying to bound media is incredibly difficult. My question back to you would be, what isn't media? Because effectively anything now can be rendered into some kind of media, and there's probably an audience or several sub-audiences and subcultures that will form around it quite quickly. So that's already a challenge, and it sort of gives you a sense of what the landscape looks like. When I was working in this field kind of in the States 25 years ago, one of the first things that happened after I took a research job was Mosaic turning into Netscape, and the research company that I was working with buying one of the very first sort of sources of data for online advertising. There wasn't any online advertising. And that was this kind of genesis moment in a good and bad way. On the one hand, it created a way of funding all of this, but on the other hand, it meant that you could directly connect eyeballs and responses to media and content in ways that hadn't happened before. And everything after that is this constant kind of explosion and collapse. So I thought about, sort of some of the big tensions that we see kind of right now. And none of these will probably be a surprise, but that fragmentation and consolidation kind of keeps happening. Every second there's multiple little forms of media being born, and new audiences, but there are also people who are tracking that and finding ways to kind of suck that up into the big platforms and own the things that hold those eyeballs. So we have thousands, millions of micro audiences, but all of them somehow coming back to big platforms in some way, shape, or form. That's given us this term creator, which I don't know how we got 25 years without talking about that, but everybody is a creator at this point. You're all generating something that can be turned into media, as I said. And so the fact that, and particularly in this economy, to use that phrase, that so many people need to be hustling for creating content for revenue in some form, that creator versus institution kind of tension remains. The spectacle versus the authentic. The fact that one person can do a concert tour and generate the GDP of a small country. It's you either choose Taylor Swift or Ozempic. Those are your two kind of GDP generators. And turn something like that into films and books and everything else. But also, I was thinking this morning about there's a little local label where I live in Barcelona that just kind of has a half dozen Catalan artists under it, and I ordered some things from them to support local artists, and the guy from the label brought it to my house. And getting hand delivery of that art, and the ability to connect to those people and support them versus having to buy into this enormous circus. Ephemerality versus legacy. So much media is created today to disappear immediately, which is, you have an institution like this that's creating or archiving and commemorating and celebrating media, but what is it going to look like in 20 years when so much of that media is poof, gone? The sort of algorithms versus actual cultural curation. People, versus kind of machine, and the fact that the algorithm tends to collapse us back into a flat universe of sameness versus kind of all of the things that you could all recommend to me. If I asked you, like, what should I watch tonight? You'd give me a million wonderful things. The digital versus the live, monetization in the immediate sense of like just making a penny here and there and trying to kind of run up, take small amounts of money and aggregate them versus lasting investment, which I feel like is a topic we're going to come back to. So those are just a half dozen of dozens of big tensions that are kind of sitting out there right now that I think kind of start to frame the conversation.
Thank you. So I think the question that I'm really interested there is in what isn't media. We've kind of spoken and touched on the role of creators, of spectacle and content, algorithmic versus cultural curation, and I think we're going to try and wrap some of that into our conversation as we go. Angela, I want to jump to you just quickly. You drive digital content and innovation at the ABC today. How does the ABC maintain public service values amid the kind of dynamics that Scott's just described?
Yeah, I mean, ABC being an institution that's been around for decades and decades, has trust just from its longevity. But I think, ultimately trust comes from, it's the people who are the faces of the stories. It's the people who are connecting with communities for the ABC. It's, building trust through being there during emergencies, being there when, news is breaking, like the event that shall not be mentioned. And that trust is not within necessarily the powers of the organisation. The trust sits within the connection to audiences and what the value that it's delivering. So I think where there is similarities between the ABC and cultural institutions is that where we are funded by government, we have a real obligation to be of value to the public, to be used by the public, to stay relevant. And so right now for the ABC, that means that we are needing to be on platforms where audiences are. So 97% of Australians are using YouTube every week. If we're not there, we're not connecting with them to entertain, to educate, to inform. And we know that, in the last federal election, most Gen Z were getting their news from social media, particularly TikTok. So if there aren't reliable sources of information on the platforms where audiences are consuming content, then we're not fulfilling our obligation to connect with Australian audiences, be valued and be of use. I think that even just this idea of the sort of what is media, I feel like, for us on the panel and maybe a lot of people in the room, we're kind of debating this because we remember the old world. We remember linear TV. I remember when ABC started iView, and that was, had to convince people that you'd want to watch on-demand TV. Then it wasn't so many years ago that it was novel that there were small children who didn't understand the concept of linear. Whereas I think we're all past that now. And I think for, younger people in the audience who have only grown up with media that is much closer to what we're experiencing now, that it's an endless personalised feed, it's algorithmically distributed, it's on demand, it's made by anyone. It's just what the world in a digital form.
Can you just continue on that thread a little bit more? I'm interested in, you mentioned how ABC is using YouTube to get out to audiences. Do you think the trust then is still with the ABC? Like, is the trust being displaced to platforms?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of if we go to that idea of the who controls, like the power shift is happening. Like, there is control with organisations that control the algorithms that have the biggest audiences. It's almost like, when you see, we'll use the term creators, like when a creator has 5 million followers on YouTube, then that's when I think they start to get power. They can have an audience that follows them. And, 5 million is large if you're trying to compare it more to like a broadcast way of thinking. But I think what's really wonderful about the media world we're in now is that niche stories, niche communities can find an audience as well. So if you are the person who is doing the best triathlon podcast in the Gold Coast, you will be appreciated and loved by your audience if you can find them, if you can build them, if you can hand deliver your CD to them or the record to them, the equivalent of the Barcelona label.
I was actually just watching yesterday a conversation between Evan Shapiro and Matt Risley, Managing Director of 4 Studio at Channel 4 in the UK, who's talking about how they've moved onto YouTube, but then since doing that, now actually have about 30 different YouTube channels that all speak to specific niche audiences. Super interesting stuff.
Yeah. And I think with YouTube, like the platform is now, it is bigger on TVs than it is on phones. So it sees itself as a streamer, but then it's not necessarily just trying to play in the same place as Netflix, because the community and the comments is a really important part of that. So I think, what we're all sort of thinking about here is how do we adapt our business from what it was to what it can be, and it can't just be like a square peg in a round hole. It's got to understand how audiences want to engage with its content and engage with the platforms that it's on.
Yeah, awesome. That's a really nice segue into, Stuart, the question that I have for you. Your career has seen you go from indie music curator through to working with one of Australia's most iconic cultural institutions, but I'm especially interested in your job title. You are head of screen in an institution that is best known for, and indeed was built to be, for live cultural experiences. Do you consider the Opera House to be a broadcaster, or even, dare I say, a platform?
I'm going to cross my fingers because I want to remember something that I'll come back to you on.
Okay.
Interesting. So 2020, the notion of the institution of the Opera House being a broadcaster seemed really exciting. I remember those words were actually used at the time when we introduced our streaming platform back in October 2020. And it was, yes, we can be a broadcaster. That feels like a fitting thing for an institution to do. If you were to say to me today, hey, do you fancy being a broadcaster? I'd be like, hell no, that sounds like a very fraught path.
Why?
And I think, I think by the nature of what Angela's just been talking about, what we understand the mechanics and the role of a broadcaster, not so much the role, the mechanics of being a broadcaster has fundamentally shifted. As well as that, as what you've just mentioned, I've been involved in community broadcasting for 20 years, and the notion of what it is to be a broadcaster now feels like anachronistic to 2025. That's not to say that broadcasters can't adapt, but that wouldn't be the starting place. That wouldn't be where you'd want to go. So we did pursue that path in terms of commissioning our own streaming platform and all of the programming that would then go on that platform. We still have that today, but in those intervening 4 or 5 years, the ground has completely shifted. I'll just knock my microphone, sorry. The ground has completely shifted almost 180, whereby we had hoped that centralized kind of broadcast platform would be at the core of our media and programming strategy, and it's now somewhat to the side, just by virtue of everything that we've talked about. And despite in putting all of our marketing and comms faith and our budgets towards pushing towards our streaming platform, commissioning new work, filming new work, acquiring new work, despite all that, the eyeballs are not going there. And maybe that's just a kind of hubris thing, where it's essentially, we had to build it and they would come attitude, cultural institution as broadcaster. There seemed to be a space for it at that time. And whereas now we're sort of essentially taking a platform specific strategy, or not even a platform specific strategy, more a sort of community specific strategy in terms of, any piece of work that we are programming for screen, who is its intended audience, and therefore what is the platform by which we can find that intended audience. So we now have a very dispersed strategy where we used to have a very centralized strategy. But I feel like that's on one hand that's okay. I've had to do a lot of work in sort of, I think for any of you who sort of work in any kind of public subsidized organization, to say you want to throw out one strategy and quickly pivot to another, sorry I used the P word, quickly move to another can be quite confronting. But essentially that's what we want to do and always try to do, is to always constantly change and evolve. So in some respects it's sad that there isn't this kind of nirvana state of being able to have a very broad and diverse range of programming that is seen by a broad and diverse range of people. The broad and diverse programming still exists, but it's being watched by the smaller individual communities. But embracing that and going with it means that we're not essentially kind of left behind, that we're still fulfilling our mandate, albeit in quite a different way.
That connection to audience and to eyeballs there that you raise, I think, is really interesting. And Keri, you lead ACMI's programming teams, working with curators, exhibition makers, industry partners, and screen culture practitioners. And in this role, I guess you and ACMI operate as an intermediary, finding and kind of sourcing and introducing audiences to content or media. We've heard a lot already about platform power and the connections to audiences. I'm interested in your thoughts around this and what happens to the work of intermediation when platforms hold such power and discovery is driven by algorithms.
So I would argue, like, when it comes to who controls, if we just flip it to a position of the artist or the screen culture practitioner, they control. So now it's their choice how much they put out. They're not restricted to having a distributor, having a film agent, having a gallery. And so the power of the algorithm, in some ways, just put that aside. If you get really good at promoting yourself, then people in our kind of jobs who can be seen as gatekeepers, but I would argue that we're just curious fans. So if you throw away the gatekeeper term and you think of everyone likes to think they have taste, and everyone is fans of something, and they think something's really cool and they're nerdy and they collect things, because that's what people do, whether it's collecting pictures of balconies or being a comic fan, or I don't collect pictures of balconies.
It's a very specific reference.
Someone told me a story, like they took an hour showing me through all their Instagram collection of pictures of balconies. Like,
can you share that link?
That's what I'm saying, is people position themselves as storytellers because that's our inherent way of sharing relationships. So if you flip it and control and abundance, like, there's so much more art and screen culture out there and really incredible ideas. And our role is to remain curious and remain active in many, many different ways. And so generationally, I'm old. I remember dial-up internet. And some of our curators do not. And we need to keep having space for our generational knowledge and newness and freshness. And so I would just say, we can all fret about who controls and the algorithm and how it flattens things. But there's so many different new ways of stewardship, taste-making, connoisseurship. Like, there's an act called Perfectly Imperfect, which is actually a way to celebrate for cool people who want to be cool, who think other people want them to be cool. So it runs on that. But actually, it's people going, oh, I like eBay. And then with a cute picture and really funny interface. So, or there's labels like Meta Label, which is, taking the platform on, founded by Yancey Strickler, who founded Kickstarter. So there's a zillion active Discord servers, all making things. So I think it's our job as an institution and a communication medium, because we sit within these walls in this building as a communication medium. And so it's our job to remain curious and bring that breadth and diversity to the broad range of people of all ages. And I would say, we get it right. There's something for everyone in this museum. And we get it right. And we can introduce wild and extreme and ideas that people hadn't encountered. So the commission at the end of The Future and Other Fictions is set on a premise of the end of fossil fuels in Australia. Nobody puts, we don't need to make a big shout about it. You just make commission a really beautiful piece of art, and that posits new ideas. And that's what the best of screen culture can do for people. And the more ways there are to distribute it, the better. But it's our jobs to remain curious and actively hunt for new ideas, or actively celebrate the recurring ideas and the legacy ideas, because those stories remain important. They don't disappear.
Your kind of discussion there around creators and the control that might be moving to creators is, I think, a really important one that I want to get into now. In theory, the tools of media production are in everyone's pockets, in my lap at the moment. And, we've talked about cultural institutions becoming producers, public broadcasters reinventing themselves. But I want to talk about how we can ensure quality, diversity, and genuine representation in this context. And I'm especially interested, given the room that we're in and the people that we are, people who tend to work in or with organisations that are subsidised by government funding, which in turn is drawn from the citizenry. Rather than pursuing commercial logics like the quote that we had at the beginning of this panel, is it actually our jobs to fund the media or the work that doesn't have a business model, to support media that doesn't operate under commercial logics? I want to bounce back to you, Stu. We've mentioned before that the Opera House changed the strategy around stream, moving from wanting to push the house out and bringing everyone to stream into a kind of distributed ecosystem. these approaches have got two very different ideas around audience at their heart. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what that looks like and what you see it meaning.
I'm still not going to get to say this, but I'll come back to that. I think the other shift that's happened in the last few years has been when I started in the role, although I was the first person notionally as to kind of bring all that work together. The Opera House had been doing very, very similar things for 10 years or more, but it was fundamentally focused on pointing a camera at things that were on stage, or the people that were already on stage, putting them in a corridor and doing something interesting to film them. But essentially it was predicated on the people who had already passed through a particular threshold to appear on stage. And so everything we produced, and even the things we produced in the first couple of years I was there, was, I wouldn't say navel-gazy, but essentially it was very much all about us. It was all about what was on stage. And that does two things. One, it gatekeeps the people who have not yet made it to that point in their career where they're appearing on stage at the Opera House. But secondly, it completely, annuls anybody who's working within a screen-based practice. An artist is working in screen-based practice. I'm not talking about filmmakers, but actually talking about more kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary artists, which actually brings me back to this finally. That in 1973, when the Opera House first opened, and this was only a fact that actually I came across relatively recently, which tells you a lot and is horrifying about institutional memory. When the Opera House opened in 1973, it had a cinema as one of its venues, which ran for 11 years and ran regularly. And that fact is sort of gone. So it is a bastion of performing arts, but in its DNA, screen culture was very prevalent. And so last year, in February of last year, we brought cinema back to the Opera House. We've had a very successful screening program as a result. Now, the reason why that's important is we've, in terms of what we present, either on our platforms or in some cases in cinema, is we still point some of our cameras at the stage, but actually we're more interested, or as much interested, in commissioning artists to make work for screen. We're actually now filming far less than we've ever done. We're producing far less. Like the producers in our team are working with artists and to commission works from them and to assist them where they would like us to assist them, rather than actually going out and filming and making works ourselves. So that's kind of, I think, fundamental in terms of where our resources and budget and kind of, public good is going, is actually going away from that kind of navel-gazing look at how wonderful and shiny the Opera House is, to actually look at the artists that are working within Sydney predominantly, and how can we work with them to highlight and platform their practice. And that's kind of fundamentally changed what we do. And I think it's fundamentally changed how the institution views what we do. We could arguably be seen, and for people who kind of maybe work in similar space, if you're filming stuff within or making content, there's definitely a kind of marketing lens to that. And I think now what we do, there is probably zero marketing lens across that in that, it's really about the presentation of work. So those, I guess, are some of the shifts happening. I think when we get to who benefits, we can get into it a little bit more in terms of what that means for our relationship to the local ecology.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Angela, I want to jump to you, and there are a couple of questions that are coming up on the Slido at the moment. One of them that kind of captures it is, when the ABC focuses on platforms such as YouTube, they go from being a national platform to being another fish in someone else's pond. Is there a loss of control there? The audience member asks. And I guess I'd be keen to get you to talk a little bit around how the ABC is thinking about capturing value in the context of a distributed media ecosystem.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think, if we had the choice of, do we want to just be a broadcaster that absolutely controls everything? Well, that's easier, but it's not actually, I think, better for the public. Like, I think we can long for media of the past because it didn't have certain problems of algorithms or a new platform every few years. But ultimately, I think audiences have a lot of choice right now, and there is good that can come from it. And for us at the ABC, it's not a kind of black or white. Like, our own platforms matter and YouTube matters, and it might be that, and Spotify and TikTok and Instagram and less so maybe Facebook, but anyway, I won't say anything more on that. We will put our content on all of those platforms, and we need to just balance what we're putting where and for what reasons. something, and there's also a connection between them. And let's talk about the creator side of things. That, in fact, Stu, I like the way you had described in the change at the Opera House, that it had only been for people who'd already entered, that they could then, end up on the digital platforms. And a few years ago, we had this sort of same realization that usually the only way into the ABC was, you'd become a producer on breakfast, you'd get on, a pathway to radio, a pathway to TV, a pathway to being a news presenter. But so much more common now is that people would just start telling stories for themselves on their own platforms. And so we started a creator program to bring in some of these people who are absolute experts in their field, fantastic storytellers, building up their own audiences. One of the first was Mary McGilvray, who some of you might know as Iconoclass on TikTok. I think at the time she was doing a PhD or master's in Cambridge, had established quite a large audience. So we brought her on board to make content for us. And then over the past year, that then progressed to her being part of the Art Of program on the ABC. So these audiences don't separate the platforms or the worlds. I think we're all playing on all of them. And I think the other part of this creator program that we're running at the ABC is about leaning into sort of what we're good at. Like, I think there is so much content sludge on the internet. I think, back to Deb's talk this morning and the aluminium cans, and it made me think of all the content that we're making now, and it's just kind of piling up, and generative AI content is here, and it's going to just be more and more of an onslaught. So with our creator program, we've lent more into what are the genres that we're more known for. So we've got Aslan Pahari, who's quite an expert in history and religion, doing a series for us, and that's also progressing more into what might he do that's in podcasting or TV. Another creator, Tom Ford, who's a comedian, is also on a program called Role of a Lifetime at the moment. And we've got, like our ABC Arts Instagram will cover artists and creators in the community and tell stories in ways on Instagram that's fit for that platform, that isn't the type of thing we would make in a 30-minute, imagine a 30-hour arts program. Does anybody want that? slow arts? I'll pitch it. A 30-minute program that's on iView and on screen as well. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting place, the creator economy, as we call it, and it's a place to find people who are really fantastic at telling their stories and work out how you can partner with them, work with them, to create really high quality niche content.
Yeah, awesome. There are a couple of more questions that are coming in around this. One super practical one is people are asking, what kind of content works? What should cultural organisations be doing in this space? Do you have a sense of what's working? Is the data helping?
Yeah, and I kind of feel like there's two sides to this coin. The one side is make great content that you think deserves to stand alone, and don't be too swayed by how do I make this thing that's fit for platform, because it'll just end up looking generic like everything else. But then at the same time, people who are really good at their platforms are very much looking at the data. They're optimizing their thumbnails. They're thinking about the titles. So I think it's a bit of both. What's the thing that you can uniquely do? What's the story that you can tell better than anyone else? And how can you make it a really fantastic story? I guess the other practical suggestion I'd make is around, in that doing one thing and doing it well, stick with it and the regularity of it, because a single piece of content, an Instagram post, a TikTok post, it goes out and it's gone. That first one might not go so well, but if you do it every week, if you look at where people drop off in viewing it, if you look at the comments and engage with them and build a community around it, see what happens week to week. You can't just kind of put it out there and then go back to your day job that's something different.
Another question from the audience that I'm going to bounce first to Stu and then I'm going to go to Keri and Scott is that we often hear conversations around whether broadcasting live events cannibalizes their IRL ticket sales. Is this valid thinking, or is it something that we should be challenging?
I mean, short answer, no. There's no data to support that it cannibalizes. In fact, plenty of data to support the opposite. That said, I mean, live streaming is increasingly less part of our core, strategy for a whole bunch of reasons that I can get into at another time.
Do you think that the question, though, bears out for broadcast stuff as well? Like if we think about cultural institutions where the building is often, the important place that we want to get people to come into, do we run the risk of cannibalizing those audiences?
Well, I mean, there's one other thing I'll say about live stream is that, it's back to the kind of almost back to linear TV. It's predicated on somebody being able to be at a platform at a specific time to watch that thing. So, how many people, I know we're not in the States, but how many people watch the Super Bowl halftime in real time versus watching it later? And I would imagine more people watch it later than watch it in real time. So yes, there's something to be said for being all together at the same time in the same temporal space, if not in the physical space. But actually, the views and the eyeballs are all really on demand as opposed to on live stream.
Keri, did you have any thoughts to add to there? Because I have another question for you.
Yeah, I'll take the other question.
Great.
Thanks.
So you come from a DIY media culture kind of background, building your career out from underground music scenes and expanded cinema to eventually becoming vice president of the Sphere in Las Vegas. I know. Which is very cool. Very cool. There's quite a journey there, I think, in terms of scale and access to audience. But I wonder also if there's a journey there in terms of audience expectations that you can talk us through. I'm interested in your view on what creators coming up now, when they are making work for audiences and consumers who are coming up at the same time with exposure to mediated behemoths like the Sphere, like the Taylor Swift concerts. Do you see that context shaping media now? What's it doing?
I mean, absolutely. Like live show design has changed audience expectations hugely. So the production work that used to go into like a Jay-Z or Taylor Swift level show or a Sphere show costs a lot of money. However, you can actually make really epic shows, one person with one Unreal Engine and or Unity. So it's the tools are there, and they're not particularly expensive anymore. It's about how do you work production in a way that, I was just talking to a very esteemed filmmaker yesterday, and he said despite all of these promises of technology and awesome cameras, crews get bigger and bigger. Virtual production has actually created more work than it was meant to. And I was like, well, what's your magic crew number? And he went 8. So like think about the limitations that we might have as commissioners or people with budgets to spend or trying to build artists' careers or practitioners' careers with them. Is like having an expectation that something takes forever is fine, but also there's a huge amount of magic that can come from one very skilled person with hands on the tools or a magic number of 3. So you look at the output that can come from, like we're about to release a new commission from Surwa Tafua. And Surwa's under 30. She's been on the tools since she was about 12. She started in MySpace, and she's in a punk rock band. So again, I think music leans a lot into this. But she runs, she runs in game engines. She makes her work herself. She sweats through it. And yeah, she has a couple of people to help her. And she works with her dad, actually, who makes all her frames with her. But that's a production line of 2 people to make a work that you would people can assume was first of all, she battles, you just moved that with AI. Like she has to spend a tremendous amount of time countering that position that you didn't make this yourself. So I think there is a continual backlash now, and particularly we just had a show from the UK collective Universal Everything, and the visitor comments were like, made with AI, horror, shock. And it's like, actually the whole premise of the show is creativity and starts with made by humans, and the very nature and spirit. And Matt Pike says, he likes to think that his work is like technology with a soul. So again, that sounds techno-utopian, so you don't have to like take it as read, but just think about how many awesome, we had a kid here who came with her mum to work in progress night who had made her own video game, and she was 15 and she was coming to find someone to pick up her game to actually produce it. Like, so it's all possible. It's just about empowering and educating people to get on the tools if they have an idea they want to pursue. And that's just as important as pursuing some skill as drawing with pencil, which is sadly lacking. So does that answer the question a little?
I think we're getting somewhere interesting there, and I want to kind of stay on it. In our like prep conversation for this chat, you asked whether this conversation is actually not about media but about attention.
Oh yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more around how that's shaping your thinking around?
So yeah, we
creation
think
and
about
consumption?
fragmented attention spans and, you know, the effect of the pandemic on literacy and people's social skills and introversion and all of those things. But mostly we worry that people are incapable of paying attention, and yet people can listen to Joe Rogan for 3 hours at a time. So like, or anyone else. So it's remarkable to me, and we need to remind ourselves that everyone can pay attention for a real long time, and we can multitask. We're actually quite wonderful animals. And so I think we have to just stop worrying about it. Like, get good at fixing it the right length for the right span of attention. Like the video essays that you saw on the screen earlier, they're part of the exhibition downstairs. And we assumed people would watch them for 2 minutes max. And that's, you know, how much attention, we notice how much attention people spend with the works. And people are sitting down and watching the whole thing, 12 whole minutes without moving. So, you know, I do think we can over worry about it. And I think it's just about designing an environment or a way in that sets for your expectation, like, and they, you know, second screening now in the way people consume media, well, particularly linear TV or films, is like people now commission for second screening, and that's like, it's okay to admit that.
Can you just explain for the audience what second screening means?
So if you look at the kind of content on Netflix, for example, you can go like, oh, that looks like a really great drama on the surface. By episode 2, you sort of stop paying attention. They're made for that.
Yeah. Mindless kind of background music almost.
Yeah, but they're actually being produced that way now. And again, it's fine and people know they're doing it, but like, be aware that exists. And that's, again, I'm not commenting on it being good or bad. I'm saying we have a great capacity to consume. Our visual cortex is so incredibly further developed in the last 20 years that we have that capacity to pass that complexity.
Scott, I think you want to jump in.
Well, we had this conversation, I think, on the call, and it's doing a thing. It's actually making sure that you're staying on the platform, whether your attention's there or not. So you can be ironing or doing the laundry or, you know, riding on a Peloton or whatever. And as long as that screen's running, Netflix is getting the benefit, or whomever's running the platform is getting the benefit of it. But it's also, that ability to kind of design for, like 90% of people, Gen Z and millennials, use second screens while they're consuming media. So it's clearly the norm, but it's, it has a commercial benefit in that it's lower complexity to produce. And it starts kind of looking more and more like those YouTube videos that you put on that are just kind of background sound or kind of ASMR. And you know, as we talked about at the beginning, media just kind of like flows and evolves like that. Before you know it, it's turned into something completely different.
I might get you to stick with that thought a little bit, Scott. In our initial conversation, you used the phrase, I think it was inny-outy media, to refer to the sphere, saying that it's not just about media consumption when you're in it, but it's also consumption when you're outside the sphere. And I wondered if you could talk about like how that framing is working. I think there's something to connect up with, Keri, your point around fan culture and being both in and outside of these things.
Yeah, I mean, in that aspect, it was more of a technical description of understanding now that we're getting bigger and bigger canvases. The sphere, there's a couple of like half sphere designs that are being built around the States. There are buildings that are being built as enormous TVs that are being planned. And so the kind of physical space And I don't mean that in a literal sense, but in the sense of like architecture now has to have programming in more and more places. I mean, you know, Casa Batlló in Barcelona on Passeig de Gracia has to have Riffic Anadol, you know, or someone else constantly kind of projection mapped on the front. So we're getting this kind of like, why are we spending time in physical space like that, collectively enjoying something? And some of it's abstract, but more and more of it is kind of story driven. And we did a piece of work back in 2018, my colleague Susan Cox-Smith and Madeline Ashby, some of you may know, for Comcast, the big US media company. And we were looking at sort of what would be driving the future of video, in particular IP video, or what might kind of impact that investment in the technology. And we very quickly were sort of starting to look at the way that story worlds and narrative worlds, and we as audiences or fandoms pull those out of the screen. We've been talking about screens so far, and stages, but they kind of naturally get pulled into space. And part of that's an ability to kind of monetize the IP if you're Universal Studios or Disney. But part of that's also kind of this desire to collectively experience and kind of position ourselves inside the story, whether it's as main characters or participants. And so more and more experiences start to be built and designed around that. And it's that immersive quality has the benefit of making us part of the story. We're no longer sort of passive consumers, but we can kind of write ourselves in, for better or worse, you know, into the lore. And that becomes a kind of thing that you can socialize around. Just a tiny plug, Friday we're running a workshop here, and everybody goes to workshops, and most people don't want to go to workshops, right? You go to enough workshops. But realizing the kind of audience that we as professionals are trying to stimulate to think about strategy and decision making and uncertainty, you know, we've just folded that kind of immersive theater quality back into a workshop setting, in part because it's meeting people where they're at. If you're a decision maker in your 20s or 30s, you don't want to sit there and put Post-its on the wall all day, but you might want to be engaged in something that has a kind of narrative construction around it, because you then become part of the storytelling and the decision making. And so I think it's you know, we haven't seen the end of it yet, and the kind of innie and outie part of it I think had to do with kind of, if you think about the sphere as a sort of surface, this was just a personal reflection, but a surface sitting against the backdrop of a city has certain qualities, whereas the interior of a space as a canvas has different qualities. And one has to accommodate, you know, its environment, the other one creates its environment.
So when we developed all the content prototypes and sort of curatorial principles for the exterior of the sphere, apart from being a giant advertising canvas, the whole point was it became a character in the city itself, and it had its own life. And also the outside is low res, and it's all about being viewed from afar, right? And that's what media facades and media architecture do, is that they enhance the architecture and give it more character. And some architects would probably say the architecture was fine as it was. And the inside is gate-kept by a $400 ticket, you know, or whatever the price is on that day, according to the show. So I think there is a role for the outside to act as that invitation, that threshold, and also to become an iconic view. I mean, it's like that's how the Eiffel Tower became what it is. It's like there was no small ambition that went with making the sphere, you know.
Yeah, so interesting. I think there's something in there around like nation building and kind of, but also like small community and populace building, right? And I want to turn to the question of who benefits. I think the promise of digital media has been or was that everyone would benefit with more voices, more choice, more access. But the reality, as we've seen today, is far more complex than that. As content continues to fragment across platforms and personalization increases, I think we need to ask some really hard questions around who's benefiting from these changes and who might we be leaving behind. Angela, I'd like to start with you on this topic. We've talked a little bit around how the ABC's mandate is to serve all Australians, and that by contributing to that distributed ecosystem, you are meeting Australians and others where they are. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit more around how you're balancing universal service with the personalisation that comes with digital media.
Yeah. I'm still a bit distracted by post-it notes, and I've probably put so many on ABC walls about meeting Australians where they are. But anyway, put the post-it notes down. So personalisation and who benefits. I mean, I guess to give us some hope, because I think we've talked today about the bin fire of social media, filter bubbles. There's a lot of bad that comes with algorithms, with centralised power that's with global tech companies. Two different global public service media initiatives that I'd mention. One is there's an idea of a public service algorithm. So this has very much been led from, so there's the European Broadcasting Union, and a number of broadcasters are part of that, including Australia. That's why we can enter Eurovision. Just fun fact. Particularly Swedish radio, they've been quite far ahead in talking about this concept of a public service algorithm, where rather than trying to optimize around, keeping you on the app, servicing the advertisers that are on the app, what if the algorithm was actually around the values that we have as public service media, around, truth, around connection with community. So there's been some work documented on that. The ABC, we have written AI principles. They're available on our website. The BBC has done quite a bit of work in this space. So, I mean, if anything, the age of AI is making us pause and say, hang on, how do we want this to operate? Because the social kind of tech boom took over, and I think we all launched into that gleefully, and we're coming out a little bit burnt. I don't have my smartwatch anymore. I've got my grandfather's watch. Like, I'm de-teching a bit because, you work in it for so long, you get a bit burnt by it. But yeah, there's some good initiatives happening to try and switch who does benefit. The other project I'd mention is it's one called the Public Spaces Incubator. ABC's just signed up to this alongside other global media companies. And the idea behind this one is, again, how do we make digital public spaces where people might want to come together? Because, again, we have all realised that doom scrolling on certain social platforms isn't actually leaving us filled with joy. It's not necessarily great for our kids or the community. And then I think back to... that was a good exclamation mark. And then I think back to, like, before particularly, Facebook took off in Australia around, 2008, 2009. Like, the ABC would run moderated forums after Four Corners, where we would invite people to come to our platform and have a moderated conversation. The guest from the program would be there as well. Like, what might be some of the smaller, safe places that we can create, in the organisations we're at, whether it's in real life or whether it's digital, to have a conversation, to build a community, to build a space where people want to come together. So yeah, the Public Spaces Incubator is, funnily enough, it's being run by people who used to work for, like, Facebook and stuff, but they're now giving their services for the greater good. And they're bringing together a number of different public service media to trial and experiment what we might do in this space. So I'm really excited by what might come from that.
Nice. Scott, you're nodding there.
Well, I'm just thinking about it's good if you are a national broadcaster and you've got the national support, which, depending on the country you're in, may or may not be declining or kind of growing, but I'm sure the battle is each year for funding is getting tougher and contending with other things, but also in markets or countries where that doesn't happen, the tide is really turning against the support of public media in a lot of places. As politics, kind of the center of gravity shifts to the right, it becomes much harder to kind of establish ground truth and kind of battling misinformation. And so, you see this now. I mean, in the U.S., probably in the next year or two, you'll see a kind of many more sort of small new media outlets starting. A lot of journalists of name, jumping ship from the kind of mogul-owned institutions and platforms that they've been on, to try to reach markets and kind of establish their own, their own voice. But it's like subscription-based support for those kinds of things is quite difficult, but necessary. And we need as many models as possible, but they need to be more strongly supported. And it's hard when you're contending with, TikTok or whatever the kind of last attention grab is going to be. How do you get people to kind of snap out of it and realize that that's all entertaining, but there's this other thing, this public hygiene, basically, that we need to support in terms of these platforms.
And can I jump in on that? Because I think, absolutely right, it's around what are going to be the new business models or the new kind of models to support this. And, I think back, the ABC, when it started, government built transmission infrastructure to send those radio signals all around the country. And now the infrastructure that we're relying on is, it's server farms in other parts of the world. It's tech companies that are led from other places. So where from a sort of government perspective are we seeing that much more future thinking on our own tech infrastructure that can support new business models as well?
A member of the audience has just asked whether a lot of the issues that we're talking about, are they due to a lack of media nationalisation / public interest? Australia is super privatised and isn't at all resilient. Is that something that you observe from a kind of external perspective to Australia? And are you seeing models elsewhere that we should be looking towards as kind of hopefulness?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of economic current is always kind of moving towards the privatization of the platforms, and as we just talked about, the sort of contention around funding for public service media from a state point of view. BBC is a great example. We've worked with them off and on over the years, and the idea that they would get rid of the license fee that then kind of undercuts. I don't know the case in Australia, but in Britain, you pay the fee to have, if you have a physical television, which seems like an anachronism, but that payment is going into the kind of development of public interest content, which is world renowned. I mean, everybody thinks about BBC as having, the kind of gold standard in decades past of media production. But you see subscription models, cooperatives, things like Substack, while it's questionable the kind of ideologies of its operators or kind of founders, the fact that it's allowed people to go direct to an audience is both good and bad. You can, if you're a kind of truth-seeking journalist, and you can establish a group of subscribers who might support you directly, but the momentum of the platform is still kind of pushing towards a more exploitative and kind of sensationalist bent. So it's quite difficult to swim against the tide of all that. And hopefully we'll begin to see some other funding models or other kind of economic support sources, because it can't just be left to a kind of commercial environment to support that. I have one proposition, but I'll save it. But it's something that there has to be a lot more focus on and kind of valuing of. I think that's the problem. It's not a problem of finding business models, it's a problem of finding what we value and whether we're going to put our time and attention towards that to support it.
On the question of value then, Stu, I want to ask you, the experiments that the Opera House has been going through, from streaming to reopening the cinema, what kind of forms of public value are you learning about in this space?
I think even as you kind of look at that journey, there was another pivotal moment, I think, when the Serpentine Gallery in the UK released its Future Art Ecosystems series. Anyone who was at FACT last year would have seen a presentation on that. And that really resonated with me, particularly the provocation that came through that about the place of the institution in the local, artistic ecology / ecosystem, and what role an institution can play in that. Because up until then, as I've already mentioned, it was very much about platforming, and that thinking is now shifted to saying, well, what's the privilege that we have? What is the so-called power that we have? Like, if you pick up if I call someone or email someone saying from the Opera House, the door will generally open. How can it leverage that in service of something greater than just ourselves, given it's a publicly funded institution? So we're very much kind of looking at how can we be of service to, or in service to the artists, as opposed to being the infrastructure. So back to, if we think about what Deb's talking about this morning, about building infrastructure versus looking at an existing ecology or ecosystem, and how do we help facilitate or service that, and what's our role in that? How can we help to push things along, as opposed to building some edifice that will stand atop that? So it's very much sort of less about that. So in terms of who benefits, I think the other major shift over the last couple of years has been within the Opera House's broader enterprise strategy. I'm not allowed to say this word. In the period of March to October 2020, it was very much about, the strategy we had was about, we did like 50 live streams during that period, about taking the work to the world, and it was very much about to the world. And how does that benefit the local taxpayer and the local communities? Arguable. And so therefore, the Opera House has more broadly shifted its strategy to being less about an icon on the world stage, as opposed to very much being more directed towards Sydneysiders, and particularly local communities, and particularly those that are not currently well serviced in terms of the kind of inner west eastern suburbs. And so that's been very helpful, because we were already on that path and already on that trajectory, and now, as somebody at Opera House likes to call it, the Eye of Sauron has now kind of fallen upon this particular part of the strategy, and we're already there going, yeah, we're already on that journey, and so that's helped, actually, has put the wind behind our sails to continue down that path. We were previously just the kind of weird kids in the corner doing stuff that people didn't understand, to now people going, oh, that's why you're doing it, that's why you're working with this community and this organization and this artist and so on. So we found ourselves kind of now very much cheek by jowl. The cinema component has been really interesting, because on our call you were right, Keri, in saying, cinema's been around for, decades and decades and decades, and will continue to persist. So we're thinking about changes in media and changes in technology. There's something, cinema has felt a little more resilient, but it's new for us, or at least the kind of rebirth of cinema. But what it's done is two things. It's allowed those commissions that we've been making and working with local communities and local artists to actually platform them in a way that's understandable and meaningful to community. I remember there was an artist, Michael Mohammed Ahmed, last year came to give us a talk, and I won't mention the theatre because it's a little disparaging, because he said it privately. So when I did a play in Theatre X, he said my family community what's this some grotty theatre and in the fringes of Sydney, versus I did something at the Opera House, and the family all came, and suddenly they came to see my work for the first time because it was the Opera House. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment to say, well, if we can screen works that we've commissioned and screen them in venue, that experience is markedly different than saying we've commissioned a work and it's now available to stream. Because I remember that moment of when we were just streaming, you would kind of call or email an artist and say, hey, your work's now streaming. And they're at home and they're making a cup of tea, and it's not really a moment, it's just a kind of, oh, okay, it's a notification, right? Whereas, your work is screening in the cinema at the Opera House, and they bring their family, they bring their community, and it's a moment where we come together, and in the same place and time, and celebrate that work. And I think the real testament to that was a screening we had last year, which was with Blacktown Arts, which is an amazing art centre in kind of mid-western Sydney, and the cinema sold out. It was 80% of people who are not traditional, have never been in the Opera House before, different parts of Sydney and so on, and it was such a beautiful celebratory moment to do that. I'm not quite sure how I got there, but essentially it's about thinking about how we then think about ourselves as part of a broader community or ecology than to be the sort of the big, what was Deb talking about, the big castle on the hill.
Yeah, totally. And I guess it's that infrastructural thinking of like how you fit into that cultural ecosystem and for audiences, but also providing that space and scope for attention and intention, perhaps. Keri, you look like you got some thoughts.
Yeah, is the Opera House a World Heritage Site?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, just saying. So, in a way, what of this goes back to is like architecture as a place for citizenship. And citizenship is our participation in the urban and rural, in the landscapes we live in. And so Sydney Opera House is an icon for anyone in Sydney and its surrounds. So to have that architectural icon status and then have the invitation to be within it allows for belonging, all right? And this building is located in Federation Square, an architecture of a public space that's relatively new, less than 22 years old. And a convening public space is part of being citizenship, right? And we're supposed to be about screen culture, we actually are. You would think it would be easy to get people to come through the door off the square, and it's not. The participation that happens on a public square outside with a notable screen with an excellent program on, actually, versus coming through the doors of what's known as an institution, two different things, really two different behaviours. So our challenge is through our program and our education teams and who we work with is to create that sort of, because we're a young institution, we don't have the benefit of being 200 years old and a really clear purpose like the library or the NGV. But so making screen culture your purpose and part of citizenship is a new behaviour, right? And that's where television began, like being nationalised, right? So how do we create screen literacy? That's because that's one of our roles, is to create literacy, as well as entertainment and provocation. And we create literacy by trying to have a breadth of program, but we also have an incredible education team. So it's starting that literacy conversation in partnership with the education system. So we don't sit alone. We're part of a really complex ecosystem that requires years and years of invitational and mutually beneficial dialogues. Emily, who's our director of programming, really focuses on it's our responsibility to create an environment of mutual care and generosity and reciprocation, right? So what is our invitation to people to invite them to want to have literacy on screen and to enjoy doing that and not to be forced to it? And it works now because we're 22 years old. So we're now at the 22, maybe 23, sorry, someone will correct me. But we're now having that generation of people where they say, I came to ACMI when I was little. Like I've actually met students at university who said they came and saw Matthew Barney's Cremaster Cycle here, and now they're doing a PhD in sonic, really wild stuff. Or the creators of their game of Honk downstairs.
Yeah.
The families of some of the developers came in, and that, like you said, you give people an iconic way to make clear their achievements in screen culture. And when we have Top Screen here with the VCA, same thing. It's like putting it on YouTube, in this case, doesn't give that individual's broader community a way to go, you made a film, you can be a filmmaker, or you can be a video game designer. And you have to translate that. In some communities, creative practice is not a valued or esteemed professional path. And so we have a role to create jobs of the future that encourage applying creative and storytelling to any kind of medium, whether that's video games, film, or whatever future mediums, we refer to screen culture as. So that's our role in shaping media literacy, but it's only a really small part in that broader ecosystem of, honestly, some kind of enthusiasm to what it is to be a citizen. I really feel like that's the challenge we're all talking around.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear that there may still be a role for us even in this kind of platform dominant environment in which we're operating. We are nearing the end of our panel, and I'm going to move to wrap up now, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell us what, this is a bit Pollyanna-ish, but what's one change that could help ensure media's future truly serves public good? I would like for us to end on an optimistic note, but if optimism feels out of reach or not viable, I will also accept answers that are, what are the questions about the future of media that are keeping you up at night? We're going to go down this way. Scott, I'm going to start with you. What's one last thing that you would like to end the audience with?
I think the inescapable sad truth is that culture needs money. It needs support. It needs some kind of sustenance to fund. We were just talking about public interest media and the difficulty in kind of wresting control of funding. And we did a piece of work a couple of years ago, research during that period that Stuart referenced, kind of talking to institutions around the world about what they were worried about. And the biggest problem they were concerned about going forward was the conflict over funding. And I think we've got to find some other way to deal with it rather than just kind of atomization. And, I was thinking about this, and, we talk about things like AI taxes as only as a means so far of compensating artists and creators who have already involuntarily donated to the beast, to train these kinds of tools. But if we're going to get the kind of productivity and free time promised, maybe we need to be thinking about things like an AI tax that can go to support the creation of culture that kind of counterbalances that kind of crush and sameness that comes through the digestion of it through something like AI. So I think, we have to think of other ways to find funding other than asking the government or waiting for customers to come and subscribe.
Interesting. Angela?
Yeah, I'll go +1 to funding for creative arts and media. I think what I hope to see is more uniquely Australian stories going global. Like, I think that's the digital world we're operating in is a global world. Everything we watch is, this is from around the world. The platforms have content from around the world, and Australia has a history of punching above its weight in its stories. Whether it's film or TV or radio, being award winning and being on a world class content. So, yeah, what can we uniquely tell that nobody else can tell? How do we use these global platforms to bring those stories there? And I think that there's definitely people in this room that can do that. And of course, film rights and all that side of things, distribution, that's a complex area. But, I just think about, like, at the ABC, Bluey is such a massive phenomenon that was a kid's show that somebody, 2 floors up decided might be a goer. Or, Like a Version is so fantastic for, local audiences on Triple J, but it's known by record labels in LA. So how do we use these to take our stories to the world?
Love that. Stu?
I've got 2 kids, 15 and 19. I told my youngest that I was coming here, and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm on a panel talking about the future of media." He said, "What does a middle-aged man know about the future of media?" Yeah, and he's absolutely right. But what I obviously consume their media vicariously. I not just watch how they watch, but actually how they create. One of my kids is in second year studying screen media, and they swear it was nothing to do with me, and they can believe that for as long as they like. But I've seen they're interested in the history of cinema. I've seen they're interested in the art of screenwriting, the art of production. My son is making music on all sorts of different software platforms, and the reason I say that is because I think there's certainly has been my perception that, when we talk about content sludge and the proliferation of very poor quality media through social media platforms, when I look at, what my kids in their generation are doing, they have a very high literacy. They know what is sludge and they know what is artful. And so I sort of have actually a lot of hope that, we're not just entering into an era where it's just a surf feed of sludge, that actually the things that we hold dear in terms of media, in terms of quality, and in terms of storytelling, they will persist. They'll be told in different ways through different platforms, but I don't feel we're going to lose those kind of, essential truisms that drives, good media.
Fingers crossed. Keri?
I think I would encourage us all to think about the longer end-to-end journey of making something and releasing it. And that's why I'd kind of turn your attention to meta-label, because it's not about just making the thing and putting it on whatever. It's about honouring, and it goes back to Brian Eno as well, but it doesn't matter whether you're young or old, it's that enthusiasm for the idea at the beginning, driving the collaboration to make it happen, making releasing it a celebration and something special, and then sharpening your focus on why you're doing it, and then continuing to support it after you've had that awesome release party. But if everything's just a smush and it's not in a notification on someone's phone, it doesn't create the impact in your own lives and the people who are telling those stories. Or, you know, if you're a journalist continuing to, you know, chase that facts and building the systems that support, you know, truth telling, if that's your jam. So yeah, I think it's the whole map, the whole ecosystem that you have to commit to if you want to get something out there and have it paid attention to, and that will be forever.
I like that return to, infrastructural, ecosystemic thinking and the whole journey of creativity. I'm also delighted that this is now our third panel where we have made a Brian Eno reference, and I hope that we can continue that for the rest of the week.
Swore we wouldn't.
Yeah, but we did it. Thank you so much to our panellists. Please join me in thanking Angela, Stuart, Scott and Keri.